How's it going, everybody? I wanted to share a game that I played recently in the Lee Chess 45-45 league. This is a league where you have one game each week for 8 weeks, and the games are 45 minutes long with a 45-second increment added after each move. So in this game, I was playing Pick 1991. Their rating was 2001. My rating was 2057 at the time of the game. And because this is a league where you play once a week, you schedule your games with your opponents. Your opponent has a chance to prepare by going into the database and looking at your games. Um, and yeah, I'm just generally not a big fan of when people can prepare against me. It's sort of this paranoia that they're going to come with some kind of trap or something, and statistically that just doesn't happen very often. But when it does, it's really annoying. So I try to fight against people preparing against me and try to play unexpected things or get them out of any possible prep. So my opponent is an e4, e5 player, so I usually play e4, so they most likely would have played e5, and they said they actually were preparing against my Vienna Gambit. Um, so in this game, I actually went d4, and they told me, because they were preparing for the Vienna Gambit, I basically just, undid all of their preparation work, which to me, even if, I didn't get a miraculously awesome position out of the opening or something, it had a good practical effect because they did all that work, and hey, it's not really of any use. So I went knight f6, and I went for the Trumpowski, which is something that I've been playing around with recently. So as I see it, the upside here is it gives you sort of unbalanced positions that have interesting attacking chances, and it's an opening that a lot of players as black don't really see too often, so they're not well practiced in it. So good practical benefits there. My opponent went with e6, defending the knight with their queen, so that if I capture, they don't have to take on a pawn structure compromise of some sort, either with e takes or g takes. I went with e4, taking advantage of the pin. They can't capture, of course. And my opponent went h6, putting the question to my bishop. So I took, they took with their queen. And here, I have the nice pawn duo in the middle. Their queen is somewhat awkwardly placed, but they do have the bishop pair. Maybe white has a slight edge here or something. But again, practically speaking, it's most likely position my opponent is not terribly comfortable in. So I went c3, they went c5, knight f3 defending the d4 point. They go knight c6, and here was this next move I took a decent amount of time on. I played the sort of natural looking bishop e2 a decent amount of time in the opening, about a little over 3 minutes. My first sort of real think, but turns out this is a slight inaccuracy, and this is a case where sort of knowing your opening theory would have been helpful. It's a slight inaccuracy. It's not like this is losing or something, and it's not like my opponent's gonna find all the best moves or something like that. But best actually would have been d5, and then we could have gotten a line something like this: e takes d5, e takes d5, knight e5, knight takes, queen takes, bishop e2, blocking the check. And in this position, white has a space advantage with the d5 pawn, a slight development lead, and all that sort of maybe adds up to a small advantage. The inaccuracy with bishop e2, gives black almost an equal position, basically. So they went c takes d4, I go c takes d4, and they played what seems to me like the critical move, bishop b4 check, developing getting ready to castle and doing it with tempo. So I played knight c3. Um, I don't want to play knight d2 in this kind of position, with this d4 pawn being under fire. Whoops. So, yeah, I go with knight c3. They actually played an interesting move that in this position I think was never played in the database, but turns out it's totally fine. And here I was thinking mainly between castling and rook c1. I went for rook c1 just to not have to capture with my b pawn in the event that they captured, and just sort of leaving this weakness out here. It would have been fine though. That's a totally playable position if I would have went the other way. And so they went castles naturally. Went castles, and they played a6. Interesting move. I'm not really sure. I mean, obviously, trying to get some kind of queenside expansion, which is a common plan in these kind of structures. You can't play b5 immediately. But yeah, maybe getting this bishop going could have also been an idea. But yeah, fine. So I go a3, putting the question in the bishop. They go bishop a5. Okay, so we reach a point in the game that I would say is like one of the most difficult times that I find in a chess game. That it's one of the more difficult times to sort of manage how to go forward. So white has a decent position. White's pieces are out. Castled, slightly better development, notably the bishop and the rook. This rook is less of a concern in the castle position, but white has slightly better development. But the question is how to go forward, right? So again, black's biggest trump in the position is that they have the bishop pair, and with just the light squared bishop, the most obvious thing I think to me in this position about sort of how to go forward is some kind of pawn move. So I spent a lot of time on this move, this upcoming move here, and I went ahead and played queen a4. So I actually spent 10 minutes on this move, and it sort of reflects the difficulty in this position. In 10 minutes in a game, it's still a pretty long game, so 45 minutes, and you have 45 seconds per side, but still that's a pretty good chunk of time on a move, especially a move like this. Sort of speaks to the difficulty in how to go forward in this kind of middle game planning kind of position. So if we go back though, I can sort of speak to some of my thinking about like these two moves. So I didn't want to play this move because I felt vaguely like I was running the risk of getting my pawns on light squares, and I have this light squared bishop, and in a position where black has the bishop pair, I don't want to make that better for them by essentially nullifying the scope of my bishop by putting pawns, especially central pawns, on the same colored square as my bishop. So that was a general strategic concern that, again, at my level, kind of is characteristically something that sort of gets in the way of the concrete elements of the position. So as it turns out, d5. So let me step back. Like I couldn't make e5 work tactically. Black has three things on e5. I kept thinking, something like if I go e5 and they take, can I make something out of jumping in with this attack? And really, long story short, it just wasn't working. But turns out this move d5 probably would have been best in the position, and we could have gotten something like this. So we could have got e takes d5, and probably queen takes d5 would have been how I would have recaptured. And I would say in this position, computer is going to say this is like all zeros and it's basically even, but this pawn is really weak and probably falling pretty quickly and is weaker than this pawn. And maybe black has adequate compensation with, the bishop pair. But yeah, I just think practically it's an easier position for white to play. And incidentally, after d5, instead of playing e takes d5, black, could insert this, but, we get a similar position just for completeness sake. But I went with this move queen a4, which not awful, but slightly inaccurate. So I went with queen a4, and part of the reason why I took the 10 minutes with the calculation was I kept going over this move b5, and I was like, does this just nullify, refute my idea here? Do I just have to go back after doing that? Like, what do I have anything? And I essentially calculated that I could, do a temporary material sacrifice and have something like knight takes, a takes, and the idea there was bishop takes, attacking this knight, and if the knight moves, which is probable, I have b4 hitting the bishop, and if the bishop moves, I've got an extra on this rook. So my thinking was that this tactically has to be pretty good for white, and they just can't play b5 in this position for those sorts of reasons. But as it turns out, b5 would have actually been totally fine and probably would pretty much refute my idea, because Engine's top choice in this situation is actually queen d1. And if this is the best you got, like, maybe it's not so good. My opponent actually also thought the tactics worked out for white here, and they didn't play b5 for precisely the reasons I thought, but this is what the computer gives. So if you do go knight takes, we go a takes, bishop takes, knight e7, say, again, moving the knight out of the attack, and now we take advantage of the pin, and they play like bishop b7, protecting the rook, and we go like this, and they go here. We've got 6 pawns, black's got 5, but these pawns are seriously weak. Black's pawn formation is great. Their rooks are going to come alive pretty soon. I've got to sort out my position, and the engine actually says this is like minus 1.3, basically, surrounding the relative pawn structures of the two sides. Even though I've got an extra pawn, these pawns are terribly weak. So I was right that I was winning material, but I think characteristically, again, of somebody in my rating range, you might sort of see that you're winning material, but I was not properly assessing the resulting position where, again, material up, but positionally, this is just bad for white. So yeah, a good sort of instructive moment there. But instead of going b5 and refuting my idea, they actually went bishop b6. This is a loose bishop. It sort of impedes the progress of the b pawn in a lot of variations, which could potentially make or could potentially give their bishop issues because perhaps sometimes this bishop wants to defend b7. Um, so yeah, I like seeing this move. It's not terrible or anything for black, but it sets up interesting tactical possibilities. So here, I was feeling pretty good about my position. I do the natural thing, bring my other rook out, defend this point, which is attacked 3 times, just defend it a 3rd time. And they go bishop d7, which of course I had to account for, foresee, and be thinking about the tactics of. Again, I spent a pretty good amount of time on this move, this upcoming move as well, not as much as the last one, oddly enough. But turns out it was basically the engine's top suggestion, and so I was excited to sort of see that. It is a pretty complicated position, especially because of this X-ray with the bishop, and I can attack a lot of things in the center. Everything's seeing everything else. Everything is attacking everything else. You got to be really careful with your tactics here. But yeah, I went e5. So I attack their queen. I invite, knight captures. And in a lot of variations, sort of what was justifying this to me was that this bishop, this bishop is a loose piece, and could would open up as things started to get captured. So my opponent took some time. Actually took about 10 minutes on this move because it is a difficult tactical situation. And they played d takes e5. Computer says queen queen d8 actually here, defending this, getting out of the way. Getting out of the way of the attack is maybe the best, but it actually the only move that sort of maintains equality for black. The move that they played in the game actually gives white a pretty solid advantage. So they played d takes e5, and I played d takes e5. Here again, perhaps best is this queen retreats. And we're talking about a situation where if black plays like this, white's about plus 0.6 or plus 0.7 according to the engine, versus what they played in the game, which was knight takes e5. And here's maybe the next really interesting sort of moment in the game. Now, I had to see, and I did see, what it turns out is the best way to play in this position for white. And I should have just sort of played it pretty instantly. But this position that we have here got on the board, and I started to think, and I started to look at these two bishops being loose, and thinking, I can remove, potentially loose, so the d7 bishop being potentially loose if I can capture here. Of course, I've got to be careful with the tactics because, these 2 points. But I was like, hey, instead of maybe the obvious line, which, to be clear, the obvious line is not knight takes, rook takes, knight takes, queen takes. This is a position I should have played almost instantaneously because it's what my intended response was, and it turns out it's the best continuation for white. So white now has pressure on the b pawn. They have 2 pieces for a rook and a pawn, which is almost always better for the side with the 2 pieces against the rook and pawn. And more active pieces in general. So it's white is like +1 here or something, and it's a clear advantage for white. But again, back to this position. I saw these bishops. I saw the possibility to remove this defender, and I was like, I think I can even get a more materially advantageous position and possibly win one of the two bishops. And so I played queen b4, and I wasted it like 5 minutes playing that when I could have played the best continuation, rook takes, etc. Pretty quickly. So queen b4, and what I missed with this tactical sequence was black actually had two responses which kind of refute this idea. They refute black's play or white's play, and sort of underscore why black should have went with this rook takes d7 idea previously. So the two moves that I missed were this really cool bishop b5, which defends this bishop and blocks the attack on the b6 bishop. Didn't think of that at all as a resource. So that's pretty obvious, sort of how that gets black out of the tactical difficulties. The other move that maybe is less obvious is this move bishop c7, but it works fine as well. Turns out here, something like queen takes b7, just regaining the pawn, is probably white's best, because if you try to go ahead and win material by, say, taking the defender of e7 and intending to play, or of d7 and intending to play rook takes d7 next, you get this sequence. Queen takes e5, and now black has threats against h2. And I did not appreciate this at all, because now if you go rook takes, they have check and mate. So white is not, in fact, winning material in either of these two situations, bishop b5 or bishop c7. But luckily my opponent didn't see that, didn't see either of those situations, probably saw that, their two bishops were coming under fire and just didn't see a way to get out of it. And they played the desperado move, bishop takes f2. So to be quite honest, I did not even factor this move in. Not the greatest, especially in the midst of games, as opposed to doing tactics problems, not the greatest at sort of seeing possible desperado style tactics my opponent might have. It's something I just need to get a little bit better at, but turns out here this just doesn't work, and it turns out this move is a blunder. So I played the best move, the only move, king takes f2, and now white went bishop c6, just trying to pile up on this point. As it turns out, we're sufficiently defended for the moment. This f3 point is sufficiently defended for the moment, but of course my opponent wants to play g4, g5, take advantage of, g5, g4, take advantage of the pin, and I could be in trouble, so I've got to be careful. So here I went with queen takes d4, with the idea being that I'm looking at this queen so that if this knight ever moves, neither one of these pieces are taking with check, so I can just take on f6 and sort of ruin this whole idea. And additionally, I'm also just threatening to capture the knight and win a piece. So white goes ahead with bishop takes f3, I recapture, and now they hit my queen. So I get my queen out of the way, and this diagonal is nice because it protects this point, reinforces the f3 point, and actually looks at this b7 pawn. They go g5, trying to take advantage of this pin with g4. I step out of the way of that, and they go knight c6. I guess sort of covering the attack here, and I was also started to get a little worried in upcoming sequences about this move rook d4 and their pressure on d4. So I went with rook takes d8. I was sort of in time pressure, started to get in time pressure, and I wasn't seeing anything terribly better than rook takes d8. But turns out I could have went bishop h5, and here and in subsequent moves, I was a little concerned about this rook to d4 kind of idea. So again, they're twice defended here. Can they make something out of this? But turns out here, no, they can't. And it mainly revolves around this idea that my rook is, or my queen is defended by the knight. It's basically why the tactics don't work out, because I can just go counterattack their queen, and even if they take my rook with check, it doesn't matter. I just recapture, and again, I'm on f7. They take. I can even insert this intermediate move, which takes f7, and knight takes e4. And this is totally fine for white, and white is just totally winning here. But I went with a slightly inferior rook takes d8. This is still totally fine. White is definitely still winning. I went rook takes d8, and again, in time pressure, I just sort of looked to trade some pieces and sort of retain my advantage, keep it somewhat simple. They went knight d4, just sort of blocking everything up, and I went bishop h5, looking at this f2 point. Here, again, time pressure, wasn't really seeing this slightly better move, just taking on b7, but bishop h5 is still totally winning. They go queen g7, just trying to protect this point, and notice I was threatening this as well, just getting out of the way of that. And so I took on b7. They played this move f5, I guess hoping for a queen trade. In simplicity, they were at about 1 minute left on their clock. At this point, I had 3. And so instead of the queen trade, I went for a queen takes a6. And the basic idea here there is that even though this is hard for me to play, because I am in time trouble as well, they've got a worse position. They're in worse time trouble than I am. So try to play the objectively best moves and keep the queens on the board, because that's just practically more difficult for black here. So they went g4, and here I thought my bishop was getting trapped. And again, in time trouble, I kind of panicked, and I was like, hey, I had a winning position. Did you just blow it? And I went for the move h3, and it turns out this is probably my biggest error of the game. So while it's not going to be accurately characterized as like a blunder or anything, because it doesn't change the evaluation that much, as much as generally a blunder does, which to me is usually about 2 or 3 points on the engine. And this is definitely a mistake. And what I failed to see basically in this position here, was that this rook is pinning this knight, essentially. The knight could go back to c6, but it turns out I have a resource against that. And essentially, because of this pinning idea, if black ever comes and tries to attack this bishop, I can just play this move, queen b6, hit these 2 points, and like I said, if I play queen b6 and they play knight c6, they're still just losing the knight. They take, and from b6, I just take on d8 with check, and I could give up my bishop over here, but I've won their knight, and nothing really changes. So I don't need to take on this kind of weakening pawn move around my king, and possibly give them an invitation to open things up here. So yeah, I shouldn't have went like this, but it's okay. Definitely not best, but it's okay. So they went knight f3, and I went king h1. This looks very scary in, again, time pressure situation, to play the actually playable but somewhat inferior to what I played move g takes f3 because you can get something like g takes h3 with check. You go king f2, not getting mated over here on the h file. And they go queen g2, king e3, and this is totally fine for white as it turns out objectively speaking, but practically speaking, time scramble, it's really hard to just think about this, visualize this position and be like, yeah, I'm totally fine here. So I did not go for that. Instead, I just got my king out of the way. And good for them for seeing this, even though it doesn't objectively really work, it is a complicating um, move, this knight f3. So, introduces good practical chances. So they took on d1. I just recaptured. And now they go queen e5. And when this happened, I got a little scared. I was like, did I blunder this? Are they just mating me? What's going on here? So I kind of panicked for a little bit, but I was able to keep my composure, and I played what is actually the objectively best move, queen c8 check. Turns out g takes f3, just undermining the support of queen h2, is totally fine as well. But again, time scramble, it's hard to see that this kind of variation is totally fine for white. So as it turns out, black does not want to capture here. This is actually mate and 7 for white. I won't bore you with the details of that. But white's got to keep, black's basically got to keep the checks coming. So g takes, bishop takes, queen d2, king f1, and again, white's king is totally exposed, but black is not getting a perpetual here. But I just am not good enough to sort of see that this is fine with this kind of exposed king, if I have an option to not expose my king like that in a time scramble situation. So going back here, I go to the move that I actually did make, which was queen c8, and they went king g7, and it turns out there are better moves than what I did play. I can basically just keep checking the king in this position, and it turns out that's objectively better. But when this move happened on the board, seeing the queen and the king line up, I just quickly played queen c3. Because I know that they just have no more attack, I don't have to worry about taking the f3 knight and exposing my king in that way. So I just try to simplify things. So they went knight d4, and even though there's no pin on the king, there's a pin on the queen still. So this doesn't get black out of the difficulty of not having their queen trapped, and doesn't allow them to immediately try to complicate and make things difficult for white here. So they go knight d4. I went h takes, and they just brought their king in. And now I jumps with my knights. If they take here, if they take here, then of course this is a fork. So that's not going to work out. And essentially the idea here was to just attack this pinned piece and try to simplify from there. So they bring their king in. I attacked the pinned knight. They went f takes, and I took their queen, because again, if they end up taking my bishop, I've got a piece. It's fine. They trade queens, and now they go e5, just hitting this guy. My next move here, maybe it wasn't objectively best, but I knew I was losing one of these pieces. But I don't need both of them to win the game, of course. So I just took the material, and now I just got it in front of this knight, just brought my knight in front of this pawn. And this was actually the final position of the game. My opponent resigned here, with the idea being, of course, that if they try to bring their king into the position, I just come over here. They have no entry squares with their king here. These pawns are just going, and yeah, there's really nothing left for black to do here, even in a time scramble situation. So a lot of interesting practical points I think in this game. So just to recap, sort of starting at the beginning, playing a move that just takes your opponent totally out of their prep, um, I think is definitely something I try to do. Secondly, this sort of moment of Queen A5, and how do you go about your middle game plans, um, that kind of thing. And finally, yeah, just the tactics, especially here around. Let me find this position. Where is the rook trade? Yeah, d takes, knight takes, and now, yeah, this move. So overthinking, getting too clever for yourself when you should have just went with the original thing that you were planning on. Rook takes, knight takes, queen takes, and just have sort of the best position, because when you try to enter these difficult um, tactical situations where you try to win more, there's a chance that you might miss some resources black has. And again, here they had this bishop b5 or bishop c7 move, but luckily for me they didn't see it. So yeah, a lot of interesting points in this game. I think a lot of interesting practical points. I hope you guys got something out of it, and I'll probably try to get another game analysis up here soon. And until then, you guys have a nice rest of your day. Thanks a lot.